So I'm going to talk a little bit about critical social learning systems. This is sort of what I would describe as something on the edge of systems thinking practice, but it's really a really great intervention method if you are dealing with a situation where you have sort of lots of people in different groups, some of whom are conversing and learning from each other, and sometimes they're not. And this is one of the ways that you can actually diagnose and try to understand what is actually happening. So where does social learning come from? What are its origins? Well, we have some origins in various names that you may recognize from your reading and study in systems thinking. Gregory Bateson, his learning theory about communication and learning. Donald Shern, who is really, for me, sort of like the person I always go to when I'm thinking about learning systems, when he talks about learning society, government as a learning system, as important as, methods for discarding structures and mechanisms, and public learning applying to institutions. Then we have Jerry Vickers, communication as a way of changing state and discriminating a situation for confusion. So this will be about learning how to act in Vickers' thinking. Then we have Checkland and Cesar's interpretations of the power of conscious reflection and appreciation as a world of represented contexts. We have Hawkesbury, Borden and Eisen with social learning as a system praxis and institutional and political and ethical and worldview dimensions. And then finally, West Churchman, Nettie and Wenger, societal capacity and action learning. So those are sort of some of the people who have given us the ideas around social learning systems. But then how do you kind of use it? Sort of where do you take that? Where do you take it all from there? So I'm going to take this particular approach, which is the one that I learned through the Open University, from Chris Blackmore's work on critical social learning systems. And what Chris had sort of done was distilled 14 themes of aspects of social learning systems. By the way, this is only an introduction to this, so if you want to go and read and learn a bit more, Chris Blackmore's book around social learning systems is really good. And some of these ideas may seem familiar to you if you're a systems thinking practitioner or who have just played or been interested in systems thinking. So you've got the idea of institutions, organizations, and institutionalizing. By the way, if you are interested in the slides, we will put the slides and the video up on the SCiO website after this. So don't worry about too many notes and photographs if you want to grab some of the stuff afterwards. Then we have the ideas of ethics, values and morality, communications, facilitation, managing of interpersonal relationships and trust, communities and networks, so how do we have groupings with unity and collectives? But then we have the ideas of levels and scale, so the idea that social learning systems can occur at different levels of an organization or institution. We have boundaries and barriers, so the idea that typically social learning systems have a boundary. Sometimes that becomes a barrier, and then how do you sort of get beyond that? How do you transcend some of the boundaries? Conceptual frameworks and tools, so what is the sort of framework of learning in the organization or the system that you're looking at? Some stuff around knowledge and knowing, transformations. Hello, Joan. Hello, Matt. Grab yourself a seat. We're sort of in the middle of it. Then there's the idea of time lags and dynamics of practice. So the idea that, and this is really interesting if you're interested also in knowledge management as well as learning systems, that knowledge management as a practice in itself has the ideas of lags of knowledge. So, when does it learn? When does it get used? When does it get put aside, etc., etc. We have the ideas of design for learning, so emergent learning experience and how does one design a learning system so that it actually is there for the organization to use. And finally, 14th criteria is one around stability and sustainability and overall purpose. And actually, I probably would say that from my perspective of having played with social learning systems in my time in sort of BT and other places, this one feels to me like the hardest, the sustainability part. It's easy to get it started, it's easy to get everyone interested in setting something up and doing something, but actually keeping it going and regenerating it seems to be a tricky thing for organizations to do. So, rather than just sort of waffle on about it in theory, I thought I'd show you a little bit of an example of social learning systems in practice. By the way, you're not expected to be able to read the diagram. So this was the idea here was that we actually use social learning in a micro-enterprise environment. So this was a kind of premises or a couple of premises with lots of little businesses in there. And one of the things we learned about this organisation was that they weren't really collaborating and cooperating. Even though they were in the same building, they didn't really talk to each other. There wasn't really much going on between them. And so we said, well, how can they become more effective as operating as a collective? So the owners had no discernible learning system, and they operated with very few contractual or oversight mechanisms. So they actually, interestingly, represent the way that many micro-enterprises work anyway. You know, I talk to people who run micro-enterprises locally to me, because I go in the bookshops and record stores and cake stores and all the stuff they run. They don't really have much of a conversation, which is a bit strange, because they're all on the same street, facing each other, or next door to each other, but there's not much conversation. So this is sort of something that we sort of said, well, this is a framework that could be used or being applicable to various interconnected individuals or groups. So this was framed as a situation which required a sort of improvement in social learning and social learning practice. So how did then Blackmore's framework sort of operate? Well, we deliberately did it as almost as you do critical social or critical systems heuristics. We took a view and said, well, what's the as is, and what might the oughts to be look like? And we used all the criteria in the situation with the various stakeholders to go, what does this feel like? What does this look like? So really interestingly, you know, first issue, not clear how those involved in the system actually understand that there's any coherent structure or there's any systemic operation between them, even though, like I said, they were in the same building, sharing the same facilities and same space, and the same customers in some cases too. And then we said, well, actually, we wanted to have a balance of effort being expended and focus on power and control with social learning, so that they sort of understood how they related to each other and how they might collaborate and cooperate. And that included the influences and processes and communities of practice, because those were also going on in the same building, but in some cases not connected to any of the organisations. Then we said, well, what are the ethical aspects? So they're very superficial, but actually what we said there ought to be is a clear understanding and ownership for the ethical aspects. So, for example, was it reasonable for one organisation that was very similar to another to kind of like take their customers, or be sharing customers, or pass on customer information? What was going on there? How could that work? Communication, there was some communication and some control, but really not any evidence of any appreciative system evaluation. No one had really looked at what was going on, how we're working as organisations. But actually, they said that they wanted a healthy ethical approach to control and some structure of social and technical learning in their space. Then there was no real facilitation of knowledge development across groups or participants within the space. So we go, well, how does that work? So, for example, you've got a craft organisation, a craft club, a music club, a synth club, an art club, a shop, a business, and a therapist, all in the same space, all potentially with sharing some customers. And so there's almost virtually no learning across the space to go, well, you know, did the space work for us today, or this week, or this month? Nothing. So we said, well, actually, there should be some brokering of learning across the piece, so they're using the space effectively. Then we said that there was some evidence of trust and reciprocity, but little evidence of any ideas of non-economic professional capital. So everything was about, well, am I making a profit? Am I getting some revenue in? So that, again, there was very little focus on how can we collaborate as organisations to actually make the best of this space that we're all in. And then we said, well, actually, there should be some communal value of this non-economic social capital so that they could actually define some communities of practice. So maybe all the arts clubs might have something that they could share. And again, that was never really explored. And we said, well, that's something that you could do. Communities and networks, numerous groups, but only one recognised as a formal community of practice. And then we said over on the right-hand side, it would be good to give all the groups that are playing in the space a little bit of definition, so at least everyone understands that they're there and what they do. And then finally, we said it was really only ad hoc learning. And we said, well, actually, really, there should be some learning and brokering built into expectations for how everyone sort of works, I suppose, as a set of organisations. And I'm going to dive through the second lot, really. So this was around boundaries and barriers. So really no evaluation of fit or coordination, whereas we said actually you should have some interactions and some artifacts to go, well, these are the boundaries of where we sit, and therefore, you know, if we were going to retire stuff or create new stuff, how's that going to actually play in our space? What is our boundary? Conceptual frameworks and tools, they had very little understanding of what even a social learning system was. So half of this was just building some awareness. They actually began to understand what they could do. No real groups for promoting learning beyond individual disciplines. Everything very fragmentary. And so we said, well, the ought to be was that actually perhaps there was some facilitation and value of dialogue across the different functions in the space so that they could actually learn to collaborate. Lack of clarity around the structure of the operational systems in the transformation space, whereas actually we say, well, actually in the transformation we wanted to have learning defined as an intrinsic aspect of the roles that they all carried out. By the way, this didn't come from me, this came from conversations with the people in the space. So actually, what's interesting about this is that the framework really uncovered a whole bunch of stuff that they probably had never even thought about, or maybe some people had thought about once and then forgotten because they had to go and chase a customer or go and chase a return to their accountant or something like that. No real understanding of this time lag and dynamics of practice, no ideas of emergence at a systemic level, so no real idea of interconnectedness across enterprises or how they might learn. But we said that actually they should have some ideas of feedback and feed forward, and then consider the trajectory of where they were all going. Because otherwise, what was happening typically, all micro-enterprises, all sharing a space, but all with their own individual disconnected trajectories and no consideration or evaluation of how they might impact each other. And then finally, in this sort of the last two, one, there was no actual design for learning in the space at all, whereas actually we said, well, you should actually have some form of design for learning that incorporated your management structures and relationships. So they didn't even have a way for everyone who led the micro-enterprises to come together anytime to actually have a conversation. And we said, that might actually be useful, again, since you're sharing the same space. Finally, no stewardship of learning as a thing in the space that we were talking about. But actually we said we should embed the stewardship into key roles so that someone at least had the responsibility of standing up every now and then and going, what are we doing about, this thing where we haven't actually talked about how we might collaborate with customers? There was no sort of recognition that that was even a useful thing to have, and by the end of it, they realised that that was a useful thing for them to have, and they could go away and do something. So I'm just going to go back 2 slides. So as you can see, I should have talked about this earlier. Bit of a messy sort of system, a whole bunch of different things going on. They had some arts projects, they had some shops, they had some specialist enterprises, they had some arts development, and they also recognised that they had some things that were outside of their own micro-enterprises system, which are really the kind of how they might collaborate with community organisations and the local council. So understandably, and these things grow up all over the place, everywhere where you've got a multi-occupancy site, especially if they're tiny little enterprises run by 1 or 2 people, this is very easy for it to happen. So the idea here was to try and, I suppose, facilitate a conversation about how they could actually learn from each other. So just some reflections. So, we realised that we could use Blackmore's ideas and method practically to actually explore some pointers for learning. And there were lots of connections to systems thinking methods, and in particular synergies with critical systems heuristics. The landscape of these things provided a useful approach. Firstly, for evaluating the nature of the social learning system that they needed. Then the critical ought to be and as is, then allowed them to identify gaps so they could go, okay, what could we do about this gap and how can we prioritise the gaps that we want to action? It could be more applicable in formal organisations and institutional structures, especially if the organisation is willing to have this dialogue and actually reflect on what's here now, what would we like it to be, and what are we going to do. and commits to taking some action, we realised that it allowed the participants to arrive at an understanding of how people could affect different types of learning in their space. So sometimes the learning could be formal, sometimes it couldn't even, they could even have had a way of sort of capturing customer feedback that everyone could have used, the feedback. But no, that, again, wasn't happening. Everything was very isolated. And then finally, detailing how social learning space processes might work in practice for different needs. So also we realised that it was really useful to do some really basic systems mapping to just get an understanding of what on earth was the structure of this thing that they were trying to explore. So they could just see how perhaps the social learning system could be part of a system of operation and management rather than something separate. In business, we seem to be very good at building ghettos for things. So we will have a management system, and we have a quality system and a knowledge system and a safety system and everything else. But we don't figure out how they actually join together. And unfortunately, the International Standards Organization, when they were trying to create their thing called PAS, which was the management system that sat across the top, it doesn't really join anything up. It's a sort of very artificial framework, whereas this was actually a better way of trying to get people to do something. And the challenge was actually recognising, funny enough, that I had a bit of an agenda here. I was trying to help them out, but at the same time, I knew that I had some views about knowledge management and systems thinking, and how things could be mapped that affected my learning interests and how I sort of facilitated the conversation. So that's it. So that was a very brief introduction to critical social learning systems. And as I said, there's an awful lot more to read. I normally start with the Blackmore, but there's some good stuff in Ray Iceland's and Etienne Wenger's writings as well about the subject. Do we have time for a question? Or anyone who's got an issue to raise or something that they'd like to discuss? Gosh, I think you were first.
Can I just get a bit more information on this project that you intervened in? Is it, you talk about space, is it a physical space?
It was a physical building.
And it's run by the council?
No, it was run by someone who effectively was the landlord. They owned the building, but they also had a business within it. Yeah. So they owned the building, they pulled in the various micro enterprises that chose to come in the space. So they weren't the shop, but for example, there was a shop on the ground floor of the building. And so they would obviously liaise with the shop owner, but then the shop also had a really strange art space, and then someone else decided to run a sort of an arts club that they charged for, and then someone else started an art gallery on the first floor at the back. So it all sort of emerged.
Yeah, so there's purpose of the space to make money.
Originally, yes. Yes.
And when did it change to thinking that people could learn from each other and improve their own performances? I think that's what
a little bit, because some people were expressing frustrations that a few people were using the space for one thing and actually it was disrupting them. And other times when actually maybe someone would come into the door and say, I'm coming to the arts club, and would completely ignore the shop, and no one from the shop would actually say, well, come and have a look at the shop while you're here because it's going to start in 10 minutes. So there was almost a zero, interaction between the different micro-business. They were all looking after their own interests and their own space. But actually, when they realised that people were traversing, for example, people went through the shop and up the stairs to get to the art gallery. But no one from the shop said, oh, come down and have a look at the shop afterwards. Or no one from, there's an arts club. There was no, cross, I suppose, cross-fertilisation of opportunity as well. Yeah? Can I just, Mariel and Simon, you next, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah, I can really see the benefit of this. Like, for example, my office is based in the Foundry in Vauxhall, which is a social enterprise. There's lots of different, and they are trying to do something. My question is, though, how did you measure success?
For them, their idea of success was whether, they could actually get to some of the things they wanted to say that they could do on the right-hand side. And obviously, at the end of the day, for them, there is also, am I making a little bit more money off the back of it? And is the money worth the effort I have to put in to actually collaborate. But for them, just part of it was realising that they could actually have a conversation. That because you were a different business didn't mean you need to go, nope, I'm my own business, everyone stay away. That was almost the attitude when they walked in the door. And they were just going, I'm trying to make some money. But actually, you could all make perhaps a little bit more money if you just collaborated a bit more. So that was the end of the day, the success is the micro business owners feel that things are better, but also that, you know, they are joined up better and they're having a better interaction with the other people who share the space with them. Yeah? Simon, you were next.
Thank you.
You were done?
Yeah, case studies are really useful, aren't they? They can also focus us in on some of the bigger issues at play. I don't want to put you on the spot, but 14 themes, and it seems to me that they put learning at the heart of the problem, so to speak. So
yes.
The primary issue is learning.
Yes. But social learning.
Yeah, social learning, and that's fine, but it might not be that. So has there been any thoughts, either in Blackmore or from yourself, about other frameworks to approach this sort of disparate community? I'm thinking particularly about Jackson's 5 systemic perspectives, of which one is purposeful. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you know, what actually is the purpose of the space in the community? Because this is rather, it seems to me, and I'll have to think about this and do some more research on it, it seems to me this is putting the answer as becoming a learning organisation or a learning community, as opposed to maybe going back to the purpose of that facility, writ large, and working out from there what the issues to be played with are. You see what I mean?
Yes. No, we didn't explicitly look at the wider purpose aspects, other than I suppose the owner of the building, who was the landlord and owned one of the businesses, as I said, kind of felt that initially things were not as good as they could be in the space, and that people were not. There was a little bit of of argy-bargy between people on a regular basis, because there'd be someone who'd say, well, all the people come to the arts club are disrupting the piece of the shop, and sometimes people come to the shop for just a quiet browse. So there wasn't really much conversation going on between the enterprise owners. So if anything, the reason why we approached it this way was because we realised there was something about the interactions between the different micro-business owners that wasn't working. So we didn't really go to explore the fundamental purpose of what the space was for, but the owner was concerned that there is something that isn't working right here. We are not collaborating, we are not learning from each other.
First time you mentioned the owner of the space, and that's really interesting.
Yeah.
He was my client.
Yeah, he was my client at the same. But actually, he had sufficient vision to go, I would like this to work better, rather than say, I'm just going to throw the people out I don't like and get other people in who will be compliant.
Fascinating. It's something I see a lot, but especially in small businesses, that people are not collaborative. They're competitive, even when they're not actually competing with each other. Do you have any experience of seeing any other national cultures, and is there any difference elsewhere?
I've not looked at it, from different cultures. The only place I went that was completely different to this, and they had the same issues, was in Stockport. There's an area called Underbanks, and there's lots and lots of little dinky business owners. And they have exactly the same issue. And they were raising, the person I know who's the owner of this shop also knew loads and loads of people in the Underbank space. And they all expressed exactly the same concerns. That, we all have our own little shops, but we never actually collaborate. Now, funny enough, one new shop opened since we did this. And actually the new shop is really interesting, because the person who owns the new shop actually comes and sits in the street outside their shop and interacts with customers walking past, and also interacts with the other micro business owners. So they took a deliberate action to kind of, like, I suppose, disrupt the norm. But outside of the UK or anywhere else, I haven't explored that, no. I've only really explored it in the situations I have.
Going back to the next slide, the process where you're describing sort of modelling and so on, To what extent was it a consultative process versus a participatory process, or even a generative process, versus one where it's doing some analysis, coming up with some proposals, and so on? It's just various spectrums there. How would you place it on those?
As I said at the end, there was, a little bit of I had to be conscious of myself as being the sort of consultant in the situation and having a client who was the owner of the space. Beyond that, it was as consultative as we could make it. So, going to talk to everyone, try and understand their views, try and understand their frustrations, what they thought might actually be. But using the framework with them as a sort of heuristic, I suppose.
Going round.
Yeah, going round them. Rather than, because sometimes, if you try and get people who are very diverse like that in a group, they won't actually tell you what's really going on. Because they're sort of conscious of, well, I don't really want to say that in front of someone else who I might offend. I found this funnily with critical systems heuristics as well, that when I've used that set of heuristics in an organisation, I've tended to go and talk to the people almost one-off, because I just feel you get more honesty that way. They're more willing to tell you what's really in their head and what's really frustrating them. And then you can find a way of sort of exposing it and bringing it out afterwards without necessarily exposing anyone's individual position. But yes, it was very much go and talk to the people, go through the heuristics with them, make sure we understand what they were trying to tell us. I think one last, and then we'll have to finish because we're into everyone else's time.
And for the participants from the micro enterprises, to what extent was the language of systems an aid or a hindrance?
I didn't use the language of systems. I just used the heuristics. Because sometimes, now the shop owner does know systems thinking and does know systems thinking in various different ways. And in fact, has probably spent quite a lot of time dabbling with VSM in response to, working with us and learning stuff from Patrick. But with everybody else, I just didn't use it because it didn't really help. And in fact, I didn't need to use it because actually, funnily enough, they sort of understood. I think I showed them the picture and said, this is what I think I've been able to discern. It's the structure of what you've got here. And this is where I think you fit. And I was able to confirm whether that was reasonable or not. And then we didn't really use much of the rest. We used the heuristics. We used the sort of thing around, Blackmore's thoughts around what facilitation means in this context, what ethics, values, and morality were in the context of a social learning system. And we just sort of really said, well, we talked around those questions rather than deliberately using the language of systems. And that, in a way, probably for them, that was probably the right thing to do because they didn't know systems thinking. I didn't have to educate them about systems thinking. We just were exploring how social learning worked in their space. And that seemed to be okay. That's also been my experience, by the way, in BT when I used to work there. It's Fight Club, You don't talk about systems. I would just do things if I was using VSM or CSH or a bit of SSM. I would never use the language. I would just do it. And they would go, oh, that was kind of cool. We learned something. How did you do that? So the people who said, how did you do that? Then I would talk to them about that. Everyone else would just go, oh, that was interesting. Or someone would say, that was crap and I didn't enjoy that. But, you can't please everybody. Okay. I think, Mike?
Yeah, awesome.
We are done.
Cool. Happy days. Thank you for that.